I should have died that night. The rain came down in sheets so thick it blurred the world into streaks of silver and shadow, each drop stinging my skin like it had something personal against me, and I remember thinking, strangely calmly, that this was how people disappeared, not with noise or chaos, but quietly, beneath the sound of a storm that no one would question in the morning. My shoes slipped against the wet pavement as I backed away, my breath coming out in sharp, uneven bursts that I could barely hear over the thunder, and the river behind me moved like a dark, endless thing waiting patiently for its turn. You should have just signed and stayed quiet, he said, his voice almost tired, like I was an inconvenience rather than a person. And that hurt more than anything else, more than the betrayal, more than the realization that the man I had trusted with every version of myself had already decided I didn't belong in his future. I looked at him, really looked this time, and saw nothing familiar, no hesitation, no regret, just calculation, like I was a problem already solved. And then her voice cut through the rain, softer but sharper, the kind of voice that always knew exactly where to land. It's done, she said. And I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Didn't need to see the expression on her face to understand that whatever we had once shared had already been erased long before tonight. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from something heavier, something colder, like a truth settling into place where hope used to live. You promised? I whispered, though I wasn't sure which one of them I was speaking to anymore, and the words felt small, almost childish, against the weight of what was happening. The only answer I got was silence, followed by a single step forward that closed the distance I had been trying to keep, and in that moment, I understood something I wish I had learned sooner. People don't always break you loudly, sometimes they just decide you're no longer worth keeping. The edge of the embankment was closer than I realized, the ground uneven beneath my feet, and I felt my balance shift just slightly, just enough to remind me how fragile everything had become. No one will ever find you, he said, not as a threat, but as a fact, like he was reading the final line of a story that had already been written, and I felt something inside me go still, not defeated, not even afraid, just empty. The world narrowed to the sound of water below and the pressure of the moment pressing in from all sides, and for a split second, I wondered what it would feel like to stop fighting, to let the current take whatever was left of me and carry it somewhere no one could follow. But then something else surfaced, something stubborn and quiet and almost unfamiliar. An instinct that refused to disappear even when everything else had been taken. I didn't get to hold on to it for long. The ground gave way, or maybe I did, and suddenly there was no more space between me and the darkness waiting below, just air and rain and the sharp realization that this was really happening. The cold hit me all at once, stealing the breath from my lungs, wrapping around me like it had been expecting me all along, and for a moment, I couldn't tell where the river ended and I began. I tried to move, tried to reach for something, anything, but the current pulled harder than I was ready for, dragging me sideways, then under, the world above dissolving into fractured light that grew dimmer with every second. My chest burned, my arms felt heavy, and the sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears until it was the only thing I could hear. This is it, I thought, not with panic, but with a strange kind of clarity. Like I was watching the final frame of a life that had already slipped out of my hands. And then, just as everything started to fade, I realized something that didn't make sense. I was still breathing. Not fully, not easily, but enough. Enough to know that whatever they had decided for me wasn't finished yet. I did not remember how I got out of the water, only that at some point the current stopped pulling and the cold stopped biting, replaced by something steadier, something controlled, like the world had shifted without asking for my permission, and the first thing I became aware of was the sound of tires on wet gravel, slow and deliberate, cutting through the storm like it belonged there. My body refused to move. At first, every muscle heavy, every breath shallow and uneven, but I forced my eyes open just enough to catch the outline of headlights through the rain. Two beams of white light that felt too precise to be accidental. No one drove out here, not at this hour, not in weather like this. And yet the engine idled as if it had been waiting, as if it knew exactly where to stop. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice barely made it past my lips, swallowed by the storm before it could become anything real. And for a moment I wondered if this was how it ended after all, not with silence, but with someone watching and choosing to do nothing. The driver's side door opened with a soft, controlled sound that did not match the chaos around it. And then he stepped out, tall, composed, untouched by the urgency of the moment in a way that felt almost unreal. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply stood there for a second, looking at me like he was assessing something far more complicated than a girl half-conscious on the ground. Even through the blur of rain and exhaustion, I could tell he was not surprised to find me here. That was the first thing that did not make sense. The second was the way the air seemed to shift around him, like the storm itself had decided to keep its distance. He walked closer, each step measured, shoes steady against the soaked earth, and when he finally stopped a few feet away, I realized he was not looking at me with concern or confusion, but recognition. "You are still alive," he said, his voice low and even, carrying easily through the rain without needing to be raised. And something about the way he said it made it sound less like an observation and more like a confirmation. I tried to focus on his face, to place him somewhere in my memory, but everything felt fractured, like trying to remember a dream that slipped away the moment you reached for it. "Help me?" I managed, the words barely there, more breath than sound, but he heard them. I knew he did. He tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in thought, like he was considering something that had already been decided long before. This moment, seconds passed, or maybe it was longer, time had started to stretch in strange ways, and I felt the edges of consciousness slipping again, the world dimming at the corners. He could have left. That was the part that stayed with me. He could have turned around, gotten back into that car, and driven away without consequence, without anyone ever knowing he had been here at all. Instead, he stepped closer. Not quickly, not urgently, but with the kind of certainty that made it clear this was never really a question of if, only when. When he knelt down beside me, the rain finally touched him, darkening the fabric of his coat, tracing the sharp lines of someone who did not belong to accidents or chance. His eyes met mine then, and for the first time that night, I felt something stronger than fear. It was recognition, but not mine. Like he had been expecting me to look back at him. "Lena Hart," he said, my name falling from his lips with a familiarity that sent something cold through my chest, something deeper than the river ever had, because I had never seen him before. I knew I had not. "You were not supposed to survive this." The words settled between us, quiet and undeniable, and I realized in that moment that this was not rescue. Not the kind I had been hoping for. This was something else entirely. His hand hovered just above my arm, not touching yet, like even that small decision carried weight, and when he finally closed the distance, his grip was steady, controlled, nothing like the chaos that had brought me here. "But now that you have," he continued, almost to himself, "we have a different problem." The last thing I remember before everything went dark again was the way he looked at me, not like someone he had found, but like something he had been searching for all along. I woke up to silence, the kind that does not exist in the real world, the kind that feels engineered, controlled, like every sound had been filtered out on purpose, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming because nothing about what I saw made sense with what I remembered. The ceiling above me was smooth and white, uninterrupted, too perfect to belong to a place where people suffered or disappeared, and the air smelled clean, not like rain or river water or fear, but something faintly sterile, like a space that had never allowed chaos to exist in the first place. I tried to move and immediately regretted it, not from pain, but from the strange weight in my body, like I had been emptied out and put back together differently, slower, heavier, unfamiliar. My fingers twitched first, then my hand, and I stared at it as if it belonged to someone else, pale against the dark fabric beneath me, resting on sheets that felt too expensive to be accidental. This was not a hospital. That realization came quickly, sharp and undeniable, because hospitals have noise, have movement, have people who do not hide what they are doing. This place was quiet on purpose, controlled on purpose. I pushed myself up slightly, the room tilting just enough to remind me that I was not fully steady yet, and that was when I noticed the window, floor to ceiling, stretching across the far wall like a statement rather than a design choice. Beyond it, the world looked distant, not in miles, but in access, like whatever existed outside was not meant to reach me here. I swallowed, my throat dry, my mind racing to catch up with everything my body already understood. I was not rescued. I was relocated. The door opened before I could decide what to do with that thought. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a smooth shift in the space that told me someone had been standing there long enough to choose the exact moment to enter. He did not need an introduction. I recognized him immediately, not from memory, but from the way my body reacted, the way something inside me went still again, not out of fear this time, but awareness. Sebastian Vale stepped into the room like he owned more than just the space around him, like control followed him naturally, without effort, and even now, in daylight, he looked exactly the same as he had in the storm, untouched by urgency, untouched by doubt. He closed the door behind him with a quiet click and took a few steps forward, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, calculated, as if even proximity was something he measured. "You are awake," he said, his voice the same low, even tone that had cut through the rain, and I realized he was not surprised by that either. Nothing about this seemed to surprise him. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice rough but steady enough to hold its shape, and he watched me for a second before answering, like he was deciding how much truth I was allowed to have. "Somewhere safe," he said, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of answer that meant the opposite of what it sounded like. Safe for who? That was the real question. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the way the room shifted again, forcing myself to stay upright, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing how unsteady I still was. "I need my phone," I said, even though I already knew the answer, knew it from the way the room had been designed, from the way nothing unnecessary existed within reach. "You do not," he replied calmly, and that was when I looked at him fully, really looked, searching for something human in his expression, something that suggested this was temporary, that this was help and not something else entirely. I did not find it. "You do not exist anymore, Lena," he continued, not harsh, not cruel, just factual, like he was stating something that had already been processed and accepted on his side long before I woke up. The words did not hit all at once. They settled slowly, piece by piece, each one heavier than the last, and I felt my grip tighten on the edge of the bed, grounding myself in something real while everything else shifted. "That is not your decision," I said, the words coming out sharper than I expected, stronger than I felt, and for the first time, something changed in his expression. Not much, just enough. Interest. "It was not," he agreed quietly. "But now it is." Silence stretched between us, thick and deliberate, and I realized then that whatever had happened to me that night had not ended in the river. It had only changed direction. "What do you want from me?" I asked, because that was the only question that mattered now, the only one that could anchor any of this in something I could understand. He held my gaze for a moment longer before answering, and when he did, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the same controlled certainty that had followed him since the moment he stepped out of that car. "That depends," he said, his voice dropping slightly, not in threat, but in something more dangerous, "on what you choose to become next." I did not answer him right away, not because I did not understand the question, but because I did too well, and that was what made it dangerous, because choosing meant accepting that everything before this moment was gone. Not broken, not damaged, but erased in a way that could not be undone. The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different, heavier, like something was being decided even without words, and I realized that he was not waiting for me to speak. He was watching to see how I would think. "I did not choose any of this," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a second, something almost like approval flickered in his eyes, subtle enough that I might have imagined it if I had not been looking directly at him. "No," Sebastian said, stepping closer now, not enough to invade my space, but enough to shift the balance of the room. "You did not." He paused, just long enough for the weight of that agreement to settle before continuing. "But you will choose what happens next." I held his gaze, refusing to look away, even though every instinct told me that was exactly what he expected me to do, and something in me resisted that, something stubborn that had survived the river and refused to disappear now. "I want to leave," I said, simple, direct, the only answer that still felt like mine, and for the first time since I woke up, He smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but knowingly, like I had just confirmed something he already understood. That is not an option, he replied, just as calmly as before. And there it was again, that controlled certainty that made everything feel less like a conversation and more like a structure I had been placed inside. I pushed myself fully to my feet this time, ignoring the way my legs protested, grounding myself in the reality of standing, of being present, of not being reduced to something passive in his world. You do not get to decide that for me, I said, sharper now, stronger, and the words felt good in a way I had not expected, like reclaiming something small but real. He did not move, did not react the way most people would when challenged. He simply watched me, assessing, measuring, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out something small, rectangular, and familiar enough that my breath caught before I could stop it. A photograph. He held it between two fingers, not offering it, just letting it exist in the space between us, and I recognized it instantly even from a distance, the edges slightly worn, the image frozen in a version of my life that felt impossibly far away now. Me, smiling, standing in front of the small apartment I had spent years trying to make feel like home, the sunlight hitting just right, the world still intact, still believable. Your funeral was held yesterday, he said quietly, and the words landed differently than everything else he had said so far, not sharp, not forceful, but final in a way that left no room for argument. I stared at the photograph, my mind struggling to connect what I was seeing with what I was hearing, because funerals required bodies, required proof, required something real to mourn. That is not possible, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, doubt followed them, creeping in through the cracks that had already formed. It is already done, Sebastian replied, lowering the photograph slightly but not putting it away, like he wanted me to keep seeing it, to keep feeling what it represented. Closed casket. Immediate family only. Statements prepared. Records updated. Each word was precise, controlled, like he was reciting a process rather than describing an event, and that was when it started to make sense in the worst possible way. Not a mistake. Not a reaction. Plan. Something that had been put in motion long before I fell into that river. My stomach tightened, a slow, cold realization settling in deeper than anything else had so far, and I looked up at him again, searching for something that might contradict it, something that might make this less deliberate. I did not find it. They planned this, I whispered, not really to him, more to myself, trying to understand how far back this went, how long I had been walking towards something I never saw coming. His eyes did not leave mine. Yes, he said simply, and then, after a brief pause, he added something that shifted everything again. Something that did not just confirm what I suspected but redefined it entirely. And they were not the only ones involved. The words hung in the air, heavy and unfinished, and for the first time since I woke up, I felt something sharper than fear, something closer to clarity, because whatever had happened to me was not just betrayal, it was design, and I was only just beginning to see the edges of it. The word involved did not leave the room, it stayed there, suspended between us like something alive, something that refused to settle into a simple explanation, and I felt my mind reach for answers that did not exist yet, trying to connect pieces that had never been meant for me to see. Who? I asked, the question quieter this time, not because I was afraid, but because I understood now that volume did not change truth, and Sebastian did not answer right away, which told me more than if he had. He turned slightly, walking toward the window as if the conversation required space, or maybe distance, and I watched him carefully, studying the way he moved, the way everything about him felt deliberate, like nothing in his world happened without reason. You are asking the wrong question, he said finally, his reflection faint against the glass, layered over the distant skyline that still felt out of reach, like a world I no longer belonged to. I frowned, the frustration rising before I could stop it. Then what is the right one? I pushed, and he looked back at me. Not annoyed, not impatient, just certain. Why? He said, and that single word landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because it shifted everything from people to purpose, from faces to intention, and suddenly this was not just about who betrayed me, but what they needed me gone for. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to think, to move past the instinct to react and into something sharper, something more useful. What was I in the way of? I said, more to myself than to him, and for the first time, he nodded, just once, small but unmistakable. Better, he replied, and I hated how much that mattered, how much I found myself adjusting, learning, even now, even when I should have been focused on escape. You were not removed because you were weak, he continued, turning fully now, his attention back on me with an intensity that made it impossible to look anywhere else. You were removed because you were inconvenient. The word settled differently than I expected, colder, more precise, like it stripped away any illusion that this had been emotional or impulsive. This had been efficient, planned, necessary. Inconvenient to what? I asked, and this time he did not delay. To a structure that requires control, he said, and I felt something shift again, something deeper, because this was no longer about my relationship or my family or anything small enough to understand easily. This was bigger. I wrapped my arms around myself, not for comfort, but to hold on to something physical while everything else expanded beyond what I could see. You are telling me I was... What collateral? I said, and he shook his head slightly. No, he corrected, and his voice dropped just enough to make the distinction matter. You were a variable. The word echoed in my mind, clinical, detached, and somehow worse than anything else, because variables get removed when they cannot be controlled, when they introduce uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. I swallowed, the realization settling in piece by piece, and I looked at him again, really looked, because there was something I had been avoiding, something that had been sitting just beneath the surface since he pulled me out of that river. And you? I said slowly, carefully. Where do you fit into that structure? The room went quiet again, but this time it was different, sharper, like I had stepped into something I was not supposed to see yet, and for the first time since this began, Sebastian did not answer immediately because he could not, but because he was choosing how much to reveal. He walked back toward me, stopping just within reach, close enough that I could see the faint line of a scar near his temple. Something subtle, something that suggested a past that did not advertise itself. I operate within it, he said finally, and the words were measured, controlled, but not complete, not entirely. That is not what I asked, I replied, and this time I did not look away, did not soften, did not retreat into confusion. I held my ground because if there was anything left of the person I used to be, it was this, the refusal to accept half answers when the truth was standing right in front of me. His eyes stayed on mine, and for a brief moment, something shifted there, something almost imperceptible, like a crack in something carefully maintained. No, he agreed quietly, and then, after a pause that felt longer than it should have, he added the part that changed everything just enough to make it impossible to ignore. It started with information, he said, and my chest tightened before I could stop it, because I already knew what that meant, even if I did not want to. About you. The room seemed to narrow around those two words, the edges pulling in, the air growing heavier, and I felt the truth before I could fully process it. The kind of truth that does not arrive loudly, but settles in slowly, leaving no room for denial. You knew? I whispered, not asking anymore, not searching, just stating what had already become clear. And he did not look away, did not deny it, did not soften it into something easier to accept. Yes, he said, and that single word did not break me, did not shatter anything, because whatever had been left to break had already been taken that night. Instead, it did something worse. It made everything make sense. The silence after his answer did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with everything that had not been said, and I stood there staring at him, not trying to process it anymore, but letting it settle exactly where it needed to, because denial would have been easier, but it would have also been wrong. You gave them information, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, because there was no anger in it yet, no sharp edge, just clarity, and that seemed to affect him more than anything else I could have said. He did not interrupt, did not correct me. You made me a variable, I continued, the word tasting different now, heavier, more personal, and for the first time since this began, I felt something shift inside me, not breaking, not collapsing, but rearranging into something colder, something more precise. And then you decided to save me. Let the contradiction sit between us, because that was what it was, a contradiction that demanded explanation, and yet he still did not rush to fill the silence. Why? I asked again, but this time the question was not about them, it was about him, about the man standing in front of me who had chosen both sides of the same outcome. He took a breath, slow and controlled, like even that was measured, and then he answered in a way that did not soften anything, did not make it easier, did not try to justify what could not be justified. Because you were not supposed to survive, he said, and I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because I already knew that part. I had known it since the moment I heard those words in the rain. And when you did, he continued, his eyes steady on mine, you became something else. I frowned, the words settling but not yet making sense in a way I could use. Something else, I repeated, and he nodded once, small, deliberate, unpredictable. He clarified, and there it was again, that language of systems, of control, of removing what could not be managed, except this time it had shifted direction. So you decided to control it, I said, the pieces aligning faster now, sharper, and this time he did not deny it. Yes, he said simply, and that should have made me angry, should have ignited something immediate and explosive, but it did not, because anger required emotion, and what I felt now was something quieter, something far more dangerous. Understanding. I looked at him for a long moment, studying every detail, the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way nothing about him was accidental, and I realized something that changed the way I saw everything that had happened. You did not save me, I said slowly, the words forming with a certainty that left no room for doubt. You adapted to me. The shift in his expression was small, almost invisible, but it was there, just enough to confirm that I had stepped into the truth instead of circling around it. Yes, he said again, quieter this time, and that was when it finally landed, not as a shock, not as a revelation, but as something inevitable. I was never meant to be rescued. Was meant to be removed. And when that failed, I was repurposed. The realization did not break me. It did not hollow me out the way it might have before. Instead, it settled into place like a foundation, something solid enough to build on, something real enough to use. I turned away from him then, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because I needed to feel the space again, needed to reconnect with the part of myself that had not been defined by anyone else's decisions. The window reflected my image faintly, pale, unfamiliar, but still there, still mine, and I studied it like I was meeting myself for the first time. If I am a variable, I said, my voice quieter now but steadier than it had ever been, then I am not something you control. The words did not come out as defiance. They came out as fact, and that difference mattered more than anything else. Behind me, I could feel his attention shift, not dismissive, not threatened, but focused in a way that told me I had just crossed into something new. No, he said after a moment, and there was something different in his tone now, something that had not been there before. Not authority, not certainty, something closer to recognition. You are not. I turned back to face him then, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without doubt, because whatever this was, whatever I had become in the space between the river and this room, it was no longer something waiting to be decided by anyone else. Then stop treating me like I am, I said, and this time, there was no pause, no delay, no space for him to choose his words carefully. Because this time I was not asking for an answer. I was setting a condition. I did not wait for his answer this time because something had already shifted, something irreversible, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts moved, sharper, more deliberate, like I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me but beginning to decide what I would do with it. If I stay, I said, turning slightly so I was no longer directly facing him, but not retreating either, just repositioning, just enough to remind both of us that this was no longer his space alone. It will not be as something you control. The words came out calm, steady, not as a challenge, but as a boundary, and for a moment, the room felt different, like it had adjusted to accommodate something new. He did not respond immediately, and I knew why. Not because he did not understand, but because he did, and that meant he had to choose whether to accept it or not. You are in no position to negotiate, Sebastian said finally, his tone unchanged, still controlled, still precise. But there was something else underneath it now, something quieter, something that had not been there before. Consideration. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand. "You are wrong," I replied, and this time, I faced him fully, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without doubt, because the truth had already settled into place. "I am the only variable left." The words landed exactly where they needed to, and I saw it then, the smallest shift in his expression, not resistance, not rejection, but acknowledgement. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if he had been holding something in place that no longer needed to be forced. "You learn quickly," he said, and this time it was not an observation. It was a decision. I tilted my head slightly, studying him the same way he had studied me, matching his pace, his rhythm, refusing to fall behind in a conversation that had already defined too much of my life. "I do not have a choice," I said, and that was the truth of it, stripped down to its simplest form. He nodded once, and then something unexpected happened. He stepped back. Not dramatically, not noticeably to anyone else, but enough to create space, enough to shift the dynamic in a way that could not be undone. "Then we begin," he said, and I frowned slightly, not because I did not understand the words, but because I understood them too well. "Begin what?" I asked, even though part of me already knew. He moved toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle before he answered. And when he did, his voice carried something new, something that felt less like control and more like direction. "Your replacement," he said, and then he paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle before adding the part that changed everything again. "Of who you were." The door opened smoothly, and just beyond it, I caught a glimpse of something I had not seen before, not since I arrived here. Movement. People. Not many, not chaotic, but enough to confirm that this place was not empty, not isolated, just structured in a way that hid what it did not want seen. "You have 1 hour, he continued, stepping aside slightly, creating a path instead of blocking one, to decide if you are walking out of this room as Lena Hart, or as someone who no longer belongs to what tried to erase her." He did not wait for my answer. He did not need to. The door remained open after he left, the space beyond it quiet but accessible, and I stood there for a long moment, staring at that threshold like it was something more than just a doorway. Because it was. It was a choice. Not the kind that gave me back my old life, not the kind that restored what had been taken, but something else entirely. Something that asked me to stop holding on to what I had lost and start defining what I could become. I looked down at my hands again, steadier now, stronger in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength, and I realized something that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. Lena Hart had been someone who believed in things staying the same, in people meaning what they said, in the world operating on something close to fairness. That version of me had not survived the river. What stood here now was something else. Not finished, not defined, but no longer unaware. I took a step forward, slow at first, testing the weight of the decision before committing to it, and then another, crossing the space between what I had been and what I was about to become without looking back, because there was nothing left behind me that could protect me anymore. And for the first time since that night, I was not trying to be saved. I was choosing to evolve. 6 months do not pass the way people think they do, not in a straight line, not in clean chapters, but in fragments, in decisions that stack on top of each other until one day you look in the mirror and realize you are no longer negotiating with who you used to be, you are replacing her piece by piece. The first lesson was silence. Not the kind that hides, but the kind that listens, that absorbs, that turns every word, every glance, every hesitation into something useful. Sebastian did not teach me directly, not in the way I expected. There were no lectures, no instructions written out like rules to follow, just exposure, controlled environments, conversations I was allowed to observe before I was allowed to participate, and slowly, without being told, I learned how power actually moved. It did not shout. It did not rush. It decided. The second lesson was presence. The way you stand in a room before you speak, the way you make people adjust to you instead of the other way around, and I practiced that in spaces that used to intimidate me, long hallways lined with glass and steel, rooms filled with people who measured worth in silence and eye contact rather than words, and at first I felt like an outsider wearing someone else's life, but that feeling did not last. It never does when you stop asking for permission. Again, Sebastian would say sometimes, not correcting me, not criticizing, just resetting the moment, and I would start over, slower, sharper, until the hesitation disappeared. The third lesson was detachment. Not indifference, not cruelty, but clarity, the ability to see situations without letting emotion distort what was actually happening. And that one was the hardest, because it required me to look at my own past without softening it, without rewriting it into something easier to carry. I stopped thinking about betrayal as something personal. I started seeing it as strategy. That changed everything. Weeks turned into patterns, patterns turned into instinct, and somewhere along the way, Lena Hart stopped being a name that fit. It felt too small, too tied to a version of me that no longer existed in any real sense. The first time someone called me Aurora, it did not feel like a disguise. It felt like alignment. Aurora Vance. The name settled into place with a weight that made sense, not because it was given to me, but because I chose to keep it. Names are leverage, Sebastian said once, watching me sign a document for the first time without hesitation, without second-guessing the identity attached to it. They tell people what to expect before you say a single word. I did not respond, but I understood. By the time I was introduced into rooms instead of just observing them, I was no longer trying to prove anything. That phase had passed. Now I was measuring people, reactions, weaknesses hidden behind confidence, strength disguised as silence. I learned who spoke too quickly, who waited too long, who avoided eye contact when truth was mentioned, and who held it without flinching. Information was everywhere once you stopped needing to be the one heard. You see it now, Sebastian said one evening, not asking, just confirming, and I met his gaze without hesitation, without the uncertainty that used to define every interaction between us. I see enough, I replied, and that was the truth, not complete, not absolute, but sufficient. He nodded once, and that was all the acknowledgement I needed. I did not need approval. I did not need validation. I needed access, and I had it. The girl who fell into that river would not recognize this version of me, not because I had become someone else, but because I had removed everything that made me easy to remove. The world did not feel safer now. It felt clearer. And clarity, I realized, was far more powerful than safety ever was. The first time I stepped into a room where my name carried weight before I even spoke, I understood something that no one had ever explained to me before. Power is not given. It is accepted. And once you accept it, everything else adjusts. Power changes the way people look at you, but it changes the way you look at them even more. And the first time I walked into that room again, not as Lena Hart but as Aurora Vance, I did not feel fear, I felt recognition, not of the place, not of the faces, but of the system itself, the structure I had once been erased from and now stepped back into on my own terms. The air was the same, controlled, polished, quiet in the way expensive spaces always are, but I was not the same person measuring it anymore. This time, I was the one being measured, and I let them. Conversation slowed when I entered, not stopped, just adjusted, like a current shifting direction without announcing it, and I noticed everything. Who glanced first, who pretended not to notice, who recalibrated their posture, their tone, their presence, and I filed it all away without reacting, because reaction was no longer my role. I did not search for them. I did not need to. People like them do not disappear, they orbit the same places, the same deals, the same illusions of control, and sure enough, I saw them before they saw me, standing near the far side of the room, exactly where they used to stand, confident, composed, untouched by the version of me they believed no longer existed. For a moment, I simply watched, not out of hesitation, but because I understood something now that I did not before. Revenge is loud. Power is quiet. And I was not here to make noise. I stepped forward slowly, deliberately, letting the space adjust around me instead of forcing it, and when their eyes finally landed on me, I saw it, the fraction of a second where recognition fought with disbelief, where certainty cracked just enough to let reality in. They did not expect this. They could not have. Aurora Vance, someone said near me, introducing me into the conversation as if I had always belonged there, and I did not correct them, did not hesitate, did not acknowledge the name as new because it was not. It was mine now. Their attention shifted fully then, drawn by the name, by the presence, by the shift they could not quite define. And I met their gaze without flinching, without softening, without giving them anything familiar to hold onto. "We have not met," he said carefully. His voice controlled but not as steady as he wanted it to be, and I almost smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because this was the moment where everything aligned. "No," I replied, my voice calm, even carrying just enough weight to settle into the space between us. "We have not." The lie sat there, perfect and complete, because the truth no longer served me, and I watched as they adjusted, recalculated, searching for something in my face that would confirm or deny what they thought they saw, but there was nothing left there for them to recognize. Lena Hart had been predictable. Aurora Vance was not. The conversation moved, shifted, reformed around new dynamics, and I let it, guiding it without forcing it, placing words where they mattered, withholding them where they did not, until I saw it, the moment they realized they were no longer in control of the narrative they had once written for me. It did not happen all at once. It never does. It happened in glances, in pauses, in the subtle shift of who spoke and who listened, and by the time it fully settled, it was already too late for them to change it. I did not confront them. I did not expose anything. I did something far more effective. I replaced them. Not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally, positioning myself where they used to stand, aligning with the people they depended on, redirecting the flow of attention, influence, decision until they became what I had once been to them. Inconvenient. When I left that room, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I no longer needed to check if they were watching. I knew they were. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just mine. And as I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, I understood something that no one had ever told me before. He did not raise his hand. He raised my standard. And now I decide who gets to reach it.